Somewhere in a Spanish prison cell, a man who once built a digital empire that protected millions of computers from invisible threats sat alone, writing. He wrote about governments, about backdoors, about systems designed not to protect people, but to watch them. He wrote about names, dates, transactions. He claimed to have accumulated terabytes of information so sensitive, so precise, that he publicly stated on record that if anything ever happened to him, the world would know everything. 3 weeks later, he was dead. The official story was simple, too simple. A man, broken by years of running, finally gave up. Suicide, they said. Case closed. But John McAfee was not a man who gave up, and the files he promised the world have never been found. What did John McAfee actually know? What did he see that others couldn't or wouldn't? And why did the most surveilled man on the planet die in a cell, alone, before a single page of those documents ever reached the public? This is not a story about a tech billionaire. This is a story about what happens when someone gets too close to the truth. If you've ever wondered what they don't want you to know, you're already asking the right questions. Subscribe, leave a comment. Tell us, do you think John McAfee died, or was he silenced? There is a particular kind of silence that follows a death no one fully understands. Not the silence of grief or of closure, but the silence of something being carefully, methodically erased. The kind of silence that descends not organically, but by design. The kind that arrives too quickly, wraps itself around the facts too neatly, and discourages further questions with the efficiency of a system that has done this before. That is the silence that followed June 23, 2021. On that day, in a prison outside Barcelona, a 75-year-old man was found dead in his cell. The authorities moved with unusual speed. Within hours, the cause of death was declared suicide by hanging. No prolonged investigation, no extended period of uncertainty, no public inquiry of meaningful depth. The machinery of official conclusion turned quickly, smoothly, and the case was, for all institutional purposes, resolved before most of the world had finished reading the headline. But there were people who had been watching John McAfee very closely in the months before his death. People who had followed his encrypted messages, his public declarations, his interviews conducted from undisclosed locations, his cryptic posts across social media platforms. And to those people, the swiftness of the official verdict did not bring relief. It brought alarm, because John McAfee had told them something. He had told all of them repeatedly in plain language, with the calm certainty of a man who had spent decades studying systems and understanding exactly how they operated. If I die in custody, it will not be suicide. He said it in interviews, he said it on Twitter, he said it in messages relayed through intermediaries when direct communication became difficult. He was, by any measure, one of the most publicly vocal individuals alive on the subject of his own potential death. And the consistency of that message, delivered over months, across multiple platforms and multiple formats, suggests not the rambling of a paranoid mind, but the deliberate construction of a record, the behavior of a man who understood documentation, who understood evidence, who had spent his entire life building systems designed to leave traces. The traces he left were everywhere, and yet the conclusion that followed his death seemed to acknowledge none of them. There were the files. In the years before his arrest, McAfee had spoken repeatedly about a collection of data he claimed to have assembled. Terabytes of information, he said, gathered over years of deliberate effort. He described this information as evidence. Evidence of what exactly he was rarely specific about in public, but the contours of what he suggested were extraordinary. Government corruption, financial crimes, surveillance infrastructure that operated far outside any legal framework known to the public, names, connections, proof. He referred to this information as his insurance policy. According to certain reports, McAfee had distributed copies of this data across multiple locations and multiple individuals, constructing what he described as a dead man's switch, a system designed so that if he were ever silenced, the information would automatically become public. He spoke of this mechanism with the quiet confidence of an engineer describing a structure he had personally designed and tested. He was not, by temperament or history, a man given to bluffing, and yet the files never arrived. In the days following his death, the accounts and channels that were supposed to activate that his supporters believed were connected to this release mechanism went quiet. Then they went dark. Some were suspended. Others simply stopped updating. The digital infrastructure that McAfee had publicly described as his posthumous voice produced nothing. No documents, no data, no revelation. Some insiders claim that the silence itself was the message, that the suppression of the dead man's switch was proof that forces capable of reaching into encrypted networks and dismantling carefully constructed release mechanisms had done exactly that. Others believe the switch was never real, that it was a performance designed to protect him while he lived, a shield constructed from the threat of disclosure rather than disclosure itself. But there is a third possibility, one that sits quietly beneath both of the others, rarely spoken aloud but impossible to entirely dismiss. The files exist, and they are being held, not destroyed, because information of that nature, once assembled, is too valuable to destroy, but contained, managed, kept at a distance from the public by people who understand precisely what its release would mean and who have both the motive and the capability to prevent it. This is, of course, a theory. It cannot be verified. It may never be verified, but consider what we know about John McAfee as a man, not as a caricature, not as the eccentric billionaire that mainstream media found so convenient to portray, but as a technical mind of genuine and documented sophistication. This was a man who built from nearly nothing one of the most consequential pieces of software in the history of personal computing, a man who understood code at a level that very few humans on Earth have ever reached. A man who spent decades thinking about invisible systems, about what moved through networks unseen, about what was hidden inside programs that presented themselves as something else entirely. If John McAfee said he had built a dead man's switch, it is worth asking seriously whether he had actually built one, and if he had, and it didn't activate, then something or someone got there first. The official narrative requires you to believe that a man of his capabilities, his obsession with documentation, his explicit and repeated public statements about the danger he believed himself to be in, simply gave up, tied a ligature, ended his own story in a Spanish prison cell on the same day that a court in Madrid ruled he could be extradited to the United States to face tax evasion charges. The same day, there are theories circulating in the spaces where these things are discussed seriously rather than dismissed reflexively that the timing was not coincidental. That the extradition ruling represented a threshold, a point at which certain information McAfee carried not in files, but in memory and contacts and the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent years inside the architecture of digital surveillance, would have become accessible to American prosecutors in ways that could not be controlled. That a living McAfee in American custody was a different and far more dangerous proposition than a dead one in Spain. These are not conclusions, they are questions, but they are questions that deserve to be asked with the full weight of what we know about who John McAfee was, what he had seen, and what he had spent the last years of his life trying, in his chaotic and brilliant and deeply unconventional way, to tell the world. To understand why any of this matters, you have to go back, not to the prison, not to the paranoia and the running and the final silence. You have to go back to the beginning, to a boy born into a world he would spend his entire life trying to understand, and then trying to escape, and finally trying to expose. You have to go back to where John McAfee started, because the end, as it always does, carries the fingerprints of everything that came before it. There are people who are born already out of place, not broken, not damaged in the ways that produce simple dysfunction, but fundamentally misaligned with the world they arrive in. People for whom the ordinary structures of life, the accepted rhythms of school and family and social expectation, feel not merely constraining, but somehow dishonest, as though the surface of things is a performance and they are the only ones in the audience who can see the machinery behind the curtain. John David McAfee was one of those people. He was born on September 18th, 1945, in Cinderford, a small town in Gloucestershire, England, to an American soldier father and a British mother. The geography of his birth was itself a kind of displacement, a child of two worlds belonging entirely to neither. The family relocated to Virginia when he was still young, settling into the rhythms of post-war American life, a country rebuilding itself with extraordinary confidence and a carefully maintained optimism that papered over its deeper contradictions. McAfee absorbed that contradiction early. His father was, by multiple accounts, a difficult and volatile man, a drinker, someone whose relationship with control and with cruelty left marks on the people closest to him that did not fade with time. The household McAfee grew up in was not a place of security. It was a place where the official version of things, the respectable exterior, the presentable family, diverged sharply from the interior reality, where what was shown to the world and what actually existed were two entirely different things. Some insiders claimed that this early and intimate experience of official narratives masking private truths was foundational to everything that followed, that John McAfee's lifelong obsession with hidden systems, with what moved beneath the surface of institutions and governments and programs, was not an intellectual abstraction but a deeply personal inheritance. He had learned, before he learned anything else, that the story being told was rarely the whole story. His father died by suicide when McAfee was 15 years old. The impact of this event on his psychology is difficult to overstate, and yet, in the years when McAfee spoke publicly about his past, he did so with a restraint that suggested not indifference, but a kind of carefully managed distance, as though the wound was too structural to be examined directly, too embedded in the foundation of who he was to be safely isolated and inspected. What can be said is this. After his father's death, something in McAfee's relationship with authority, with institutions, with the idea of systems that claim to protect while actually destroying, crystallized. He was no longer simply a perceptive child in an uncomfortable household. He was a young man with a specific and personal understanding of the distance between what power presents itself as and what it actually does. He carried that understanding into his education with unusual intensity. McAfee attended Roanoke College in Virginia, where he studied mathematics. Those who encountered him during this period described someone who was intellectually voracious in a way that went beyond ordinary academic ambition. He was not simply interested in solving the problems that were assigned to him. He was interested in the structures beneath the problems, the logic systems, the patterns, the underlying architecture of how things worked, and more importantly, how they could be made to work differently. Mathematics, at its deepest level, is the study of hidden order. It is the discipline of finding the real structure beneath the apparent one, of proving that what seems chaotic or arbitrary actually follows rules that most people cannot see. For a mind like McAfee's, a mind already trained by experience to distrust surfaces and search for what lay beneath them, it was a natural home. But formal education with its prescribed paths and institutional constraints could only hold him for so long. After graduating, McAfee moved through a series of positions that traced the emerging contours of the computer age, working at institutions including NASA and Xerox, absorbing the technical culture of a field that was still young enough to be genuinely open, still wild enough at its edges to reward unconventional thinking. He was not, by any account from this period, an easy colleague. He was impatient with hierarchy, uncomfortable with the idea that seniority conferred authority over someone who could simply see further than those above him. According to certain reports, McAfee also developed during this period a relationship with substances that would recur throughout his life, not in the manner of someone seeking escape, but in the manner of someone conducting a relentless and somewhat reckless experiment on his own consciousness. As though the inside of his mind was another system to be understood, another architecture to be mapped and tested and pushed to its limits. This pattern, the refusal of conventional boundaries, the appetite for experience at the edges of what was safe or sanctioned, the deep suspicion of any authority that could not justify itself on purely rational grounds, would define him for the rest of his life. It would also make him extraordinarily difficult to contain, extraordinarily difficult to predict, and extraordinarily dangerous to anyone who preferred that certain things remain hidden. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, none of that danger had yet crystallized into something the world could see. John McAfee was simply a highly intelligent, deeply unconventional programmer moving through a world that was about to transform itself in ways that almost no one fully understood yet. He understood it, not perfectly, not completely, but he saw earlier than most that the coming revolution in computing was not simply a technological event, it was a civilizational shift. A restructuring of how information moved, how it was stored, how it could be accessed, and how it could be exploited. He saw that the same networks being built to connect and empower ordinary people could, with the right adjustments, be turned into something else entirely, into surveillance infrastructure, into control mechanisms, into systems that watched while presenting themselves as systems that served. He saw this not as speculation, but as a technical reality, as a natural consequence of how the architecture was being constructed, and he filed this understanding away, the way he filed away everything that mattered, not in any place that could be easily found or easily taken, but somewhere deep in the internal architecture of who he was. The world was building something enormous, and John McAfee, with his peculiar history and his peculiar mind, was going to make himself indispensable to it. Whether that indispensability would ultimately protect him or destroy him was a question that would take another 4 decades to answer, and the answer, when it finally came, arrived in the most irreversible way possible. But before the end, there was the beginning of his power. Before the silence, there was the moment when John McAfee looked at an invisible threat spreading through the world's computers, a threat that almost no one else had yet taken seriously, and decided that he was the one who would stop it, and in doing so made himself into something that could not be ignored. There is a particular moment in the history of technology that most people have forgotten or never fully understood because it happened in the background of ordinary life, in offices and laboratories, in the humming quiet of early computer rooms, where machines that cost more than houses processed information at speeds that seemed at the time almost miraculous. It was a moment before the internet, as the world now knows it existed, before personal computers sat on every desk and in every pocket, before the digital and the physical had merged so completely that the boundary between them became essentially meaningless. It was the moment when the first malicious code began to move. The early viruses were, by modern standards, primitive. They were experiments, curiosities, sometimes pranks, pieces of self-replicating code that spread through shared floppy disks, that attached themselves to programs and traveled wherever those programs traveled, quietly duplicating themselves in the background of systems that had no mechanism for detecting them. They did not, in those early days, always cause dramatic damage, but they represented something profound. They were proof that the digital systems being built to serve human beings could be infiltrated, could be turned, could carry, hidden inside their normal operations, something that had been placed there by someone with intentions that were not benign. John McAfee saw this earlier, according to certain reports, than almost anyone working outside the most specialized research environments, and he saw it not merely as a technical problem to be solved, but as a philosophical one, as evidence of a fundamental truth about all systems, digital or otherwise, that any architecture complex enough to be useful was also complex enough to be compromised, that the same properties that made a network powerful made it vulnerable, that the openness and danger were not opposites, but partners. In 1987, McAfee encountered one of the first viruses to spread significantly among personal computer users, a piece of code known as the brain virus, originating from Pakistan, designed to protect software from unauthorized copying, but spreading far beyond any intention its creators might have had. McAfee studied it, dissected it, understood it at a structural level that required both deep technical skill and a particular kind of imaginative empathy, the ability to think like the thing you were trying to defeat. And then he built something to stop it. McAfee Associates was founded in 1987, operating initially out of McAfee's home in Santa Clara, California. The company's first product was a piece of antivirus software, simple by later standards, but revolutionary in its moment. It was software designed to do something that had never been systematically attempted at a commercial scale, to patrol the interior of a computer system, to recognize the signatures of malicious code, and to neutralize it before it could spread or cause damage. He distributed the software initially for free. This decision, which seemed counterintuitive from a business perspective, was in retrospect an act of extraordinary strategic intelligence. By giving the software away, McAfee seeded it into thousands of systems almost immediately. He built a user base before he built a revenue model. He established trust and presence before he asked for anything in return. And in doing so, he created something more valuable than an early customer list. He created dependency. A world that had accepted his software into its systems was a world that needed him to keep updating it, keep improving it, keep standing between their data and the invisible threats that were multiplying with each passing year. The threats did multiply with a speed that seemed to those watching closely almost deliberate. There are theories, and they have never been conclusively proven or disproven, that the explosion of computer viruses in the late 1980s and early 1990s was not entirely organic. That some of the malicious code circulating through early networks had origins that were not simply the work of bored programmers or ideological hackers, but of institutional actors with specific interests in creating a climate of digital insecurity, a climate that would justify investment in security infrastructure, that would create markets, dependencies, and, most importantly, access. Because here's the thing that McAfee understood about antivirus software that most of his customers did not. To protect a system from intrusion, security software requires deep, privileged access to that system. It needs to see everything. It needs to operate at the level of the machine's core processes, reading files, monitoring behavior, examining the interior architecture of a computer in ways that no ordinary program is permitted to do. Antivirus software, by its very nature, is the most intimate thing you can install on a machine, more intimate than any document you store there. More intimate than any communication you send from it. It sees everything. McAfee built a business on that intimacy. He built an empire on it. By the early 1990s, McAfee Associates had become one of the most successful software companies in America. Its product installed on millions of machines across dozens of countries. Its name synonymous with the concept of digital protection. When the company went public in 1992, the valuation confirmed what the growth trajectory had already suggested. John McAfee had not merely entered the technology industry, he had inserted himself into the nervous system of the digital world at exactly the moment when that nervous system was expanding fastest. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful men in technology, and he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable about what that power meant, about what he was seeing from his particular vantage point inside the architecture of global computing, about the questions that his own expertise was forcing him to confront, questions that had no comfortable answers and that pointed in directions that the technology industry and the governments that were beginning to take a very close interest in it would have preferred not to be pointed. According to certain reports, McAfee began during this period to develop what colleagues described as an unusual preoccupation with the relationship between security software and state surveillance. He was not, by his own account, naive about the potential for the technology he had built to be repurposed. He understood, better than almost anyone, that the architecture of protection and the architecture of surveillance were not merely similar, they were, at a technical level, almost identical. That a system designed to monitor a computer for malicious intrusions could, with modifications that were not particularly complex, be redesigned to monitor that computer for anything at all, and to report what it found to anyone with the right access credentials. He understood this because he had built it, what he claimed to have discovered, and here the accounts diverge and certainty becomes impossible. And the territory we are entering is one of suggestion and implication rather than documented fact, was that this repurposing was not theoretical, was not a future risk to be guarded against, was already happening, had been happening, in various forms and at various scales since the earliest days of the commercial internet. Some insiders claim that McAfee, during his time at the apex of the antivirus industry, was approached by representatives of government agencies, not necessarily American ones, and not necessarily ones that operated within the publicly acknowledged structure of legitimate intelligence services, with proposals that he found deeply troubling, proposals that concerned the capabilities of security software. That concerned what it could see and who it could be made to report to, and how those reports could be routed through systems that left no visible trace in the official record. Whether these approaches happened as described, whether McAfee's response to them was what his later accounts suggested, whether the knowledge he claimed to have accumulated during this period was as specific and as dangerous as he implied, none of this can be verified from the outside. The people who would know are not speaking. The documents that would confirm or deny these accounts have not surfaced. What can be said is that sometime in the early 1990s, John McAfee began to change. The transformation was not sudden, it was gradual, and it expressed itself in ways that could be interpreted and were interpreted by most observers as simple eccentricity, as the predictable deterioration of a high-pressure entrepreneur who had built something enormous and was struggling with the weight of it. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations of McAfee Associates. He sold the majority of his stake in the company. He began, with increasing intensity, to move away from the world he had built, not in the manner of a man pursuing leisure, but in the manner of a man putting distance between himself and something he had seen too clearly to be comfortable remaining near. By the mid-1990s, he had divested almost entirely from the company that bore his name. He was worth, by various estimates, over $100 million. He was free, in the material sense, to do anything he wanted with the rest of his life. What he chose to do was disappear into the margins, into yoga communities and aerotrekking adventures, and the studied cultivation of a persona so bizarre and unpredictable that it functioned, whether by accident or design, as its own kind of camouflage. There are theories that this eccentricity was not entirely authentic, that the man who had spent his career building systems that hid their true functions behind reassuring interfaces had learned better than anyone how to apply that same principle to himself, that the chaos he projected was a screen, and that behind it John McAfee continued to watch, to accumulate, to understand things that he could not yet say out loud. What he had seen from inside the architecture of global security software, that was not something that could be unseen, and it was only the beginning of what he would come to know. There's a particular kind of freedom that only the very wealthy and the very reckless ever truly experience. Not the freedom of comfort, which is merely the absence of immediate constraint, but the freedom of complete disconnection from obligation, from consequence, from the ordinary gravitational pull of a life embedded in institutions and relationships, and the slow accumulation of social accountability. It is a freedom that looks from the outside like liberation, and from the inside, according to those who have lived it, feels more like falling. John McAfee fell deliberately, and he fell far. After his departure from the company that bore his name, he entered a period that his biographers and journalists would later struggle to characterize accurately because it resisted the neat narrative categories that make lives legible. It was not a breakdown. It was not a retirement. It was not, despite the surface appearances, simply the dissolution of a successful man into excess and absurdity. It was something more intentional than any of those descriptions allow for, something that, viewed in the context of everything that came before and everything that came after, begins to look less like chaos and more like a very specific kind of strategic withdrawal. He moved constantly through different properties, different communities, different countries. He invested in technologies that interested him, pursued philosophical and spiritual frameworks with the same voracious intensity he had once directed at computer code, and cultivated relationships across an extraordinarily wide social spectrum, from academic researchers to spiritual teachers to individuals operating at the absolute margins of legality in multiple jurisdictions. This last category is worth examining carefully, because one of the things that becomes clear when you study McAfee's movements during the late 1990s and early 2000s is that his appetite for marginal spaces, for the places where official systems lost their grip and unofficial ones took over, was not random. It was patterned. He was drawn repeatedly and consistently to the places where information moved freely, where the normal architecture of surveillance and control was thinner, where people who needed to exist outside official systems went to exist. He was learning something in these places. accumulating something, building a map according to certain reports of the invisible geography of the world, the networks that operated beneath the surface of legitimate institutions, the flows of money and information and influence that connected them, the people who moved between official and unofficial worlds with the ease of those who understood that the boundary between them was, at a certain level of power, essentially meaningless, whether this accumulation was conscious from the beginning or whether it became conscious only gradually as McAfee realized what he was sitting in the middle of. That is impossible to say with certainty. What is clear is that by the time he made his most dramatic geographical relocation, he was not simply a wealthy eccentric seeking adventure. He was a man with a specific and sophisticated understanding of how hidden systems worked, carrying that understanding into one of the most complex and dangerous informal economies on the planet. In 2008, John McAfee moved to Belize. The decision was presented publicly to the extent that McAfee presented anything publicly during this period as a lifestyle choice, a search for warmth and remoteness, and the kind of radical freedom that Central American geography could provide to someone with sufficient resources. He acquired significant property. He established himself in the community of Ambergris Caye, an island off the Belizean coast, with the thoroughness of someone who intended to stay. What he built there was, by any measure, extraordinary. His compound on the island was not simply a wealthy man's retreat. It was, according to those who visited or worked there, something closer to a small sovereign state. It had its own security infrastructure, its own communication systems, its own internal economy. McAfee employed a significant number of local people, establishing relationships of loyalty and dependency that gave him both protection and intelligence. A constant flow of information about what was happening around him, who was asking questions, who was moving through the area, what the local authorities were doing, and why. He was also, according to certain reports, conducting research. The specific nature of this research has never been fully documented or verified. McAfee described it publicly as work in natural antibiotics, an investigation into the pharmacological properties of local plants and compounds that had not been studied by mainstream science. This is plausible. It is consistent with other aspects of his intellectual character and his documented interest in unconventional science. But some insiders claim that the pharmaceutical research was only one dimension of what McAfee was doing in Belize. That his real work during this period was informational rather than chemical, that the compound on Ambergris Caye was, among other things, an intelligence-gathering operation, a node in a network of contacts and sources that McAfee was building across Central America, feeding into the larger architecture of knowledge he had been constructing since his departure from the technology industry. What did that knowledge concern? Here, the accounts become of necessity less specific. But the consistent thread running through multiple independent sources is this. McAfee's time in Belize brought him into contact with information about the relationship between regional governments and the global surveillance infrastructure he had spent decades thinking about how data collected through commercial systems very much like the ones he had helped build, was being channeled into networks that served interests far removed from any publicly accountable institution. He was not simply observing this from a distance, he was, by multiple accounts, embedded in it, connected to people on multiple sides of multiple invisible lines, receiving information from sources that trusted him for reasons that were complex and not always entirely clear, with things they told almost no one else. This made him valuable. It also made him dangerous. The precise sequence of events that led to the catastrophic rupture of McAfee's Belizean existence is, like so much of his story, obscured by competing accounts, official narratives that raise more questions than they answer, and the absence of documentation that should exist but cannot be found. What is clear is that in November 2012, his neighbor, a man named Gregory Fall, an American expatriate living nearby on Ambergris Caye, was found dead, shot once in the back of the head. The Belizean authorities named McAfee as a person of interest almost immediately. McAfee denied any involvement with absolute consistency from the first moment the accusation appeared until the last interview he ever gave. He described the investigation as a frame, as an attempt by the Belizean government, which he claimed had been seeking leverage against him for months, to use the death of his neighbor as a mechanism to bring him into custody where he could be controlled, silenced, or worse. He did not wait to find out which. He ran. What followed was one of the most extraordinary public flights in modern history, a weeks-long chase across Central America that McAfee documented with a theatricality that seemed almost designed to court attention through blog posts and interviews conducted from undisclosed locations. He disguised himself. He moved constantly. He gave interviews to journalists he had invited to accompany him, turning his own pursuit into a media spectacle that he seemed simultaneously to be using as protection and as platform. It was during this flight that McAfee first began speaking publicly with any degree of specificity about what he claimed to know, about the nature of the forces he believed were pursuing him, about the relationship between the Belizean government and larger interests he described only in general terms, interests that operated across borders, that had resources exceeding any individual nation-state, that had very specific reasons for wanting him contained. He was, by this point, being watched by the entire world, which was, their theories suggest, exactly what he wanted. Because a man being watched by the entire world is a man who is very difficult to quietly disappear. He understood that. He had always understood that. The same instinct that had led him to distribute his antivirus software for free, to build presence and dependency before building anything else, was operating here. He was making himself too visible to be conveniently erased. He was turning his own pursuit into a story that millions of people were following, so that if anything happened to him, it would happen in front of an audience. It was a strategy, a sophisticated one, but strategies have limits. And the forces McAfee believed were arrayed against him were not, if his account was accurate, the kind that were deterred by public attention. They were the kind that had learned over many decades and in many different contexts how to operate in plain sight, how to do in full view what could not be questioned, because the official narrative had already been constructed and distributed and accepted before the questions could form. He eventually crossed into Guatemala, was briefly detained there, and was ultimately allowed to travel to the United States. Not the return of a fugitive, but something more ambiguous. Something that suggested to those reading the situation carefully that a negotiation had taken place, that an accommodation had been reached, that McAfee had returned not because he had been captured, but because something had been agreed. What that agreement was, if it existed at all, has never been disclosed, but McAfee returned a changed man, quieter in some ways, louder in others, more focused, more deliberate, as though the chase had clarified something for him, as though the experience of being hunted, of understanding from the inside exactly how the machinery of pursuit operated, had given him information he could not have obtained any other way. He had been inside the system. He had watched it move against him. He had survived it. And now he knew how it worked. There is a moment in the life of every person who has seen something they were not supposed to see, when the question ceases to be, what did I find, and becomes, what do I do with it? It is a threshold moment. A point of no return, not because the knowledge itself is irreversible, though it may be, but because the act of possessing it changes the relationship between the person who holds it and every institution that would prefer it remain hidden. You cannot unknow what you know, and the systems that work to keep certain things unknown are very good at identifying the moment when someone crosses that threshold. John McAfee crossed it. The question that his story forces us to confront is not whether he crossed it, but how far beyond it he traveled, and what he found on the other side. To understand what McAfee claimed to have discovered, it is necessary to understand something about the world he had inhabited professionally for decades. The antivirus industry, at its apex in the 1990s and early 2000s, was not simply a commercial technology sector. It was, in a very precise sense, an intelligence infrastructure. The companies operating within it had, by the nature of their products, deeper access to the interior architecture of global computing than any other commercial entities on Earth. They saw what moved through networks. They could identify the signatures of specific actors. They had visibility into systems, government systems, corporate systems, financial systems, personal systems that no intelligence agency, however well resourced, could match through any other means. This visibility was officially used for protection, for the identification and neutralization of malicious code, for the defense of the digital systems that modern civilization had come to depend upon so completely that their compromise would constitute something close to civilizational collapse. But visibility of that depth and breadth is not simply a defensive asset. It is one of the most powerful intelligence tools ever constructed. And according to certain reports, the relationship between the major antivirus companies and the intelligence communities of multiple nation-states was, during this period, far more intimate and far less transparent than anything disclosed in public regulatory filings or congressional testimony. McAfee had built one of the foundational companies of this ecosystem. He had been inside it at its most formative moment. He had seen, at a level of technical and operational specificity that very few people ever achieved, how the architecture actually functioned, not the architecture as it was described in press releases and product documentation and the reassuring language of corporate security communications. The actual architecture, the real one, the one that existed beneath the presented surface in the same way that the real structure of every system he had ever studied existed beneath its presented surface. What he saw there, what he claimed to have seen there, was a system of extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary ambition, a system that had been built incrementally and deliberately over the course of decades, using the commercial infrastructure of the technology industry as its public face and its delivery mechanism. A system designed not to protect the data of ordinary people, but to collect it, to aggregate it, to make it available through channels that left no traceable connection to any publicly accountable institution, to actors whose identities and intentions were not disclosed to any oversight body anywhere in the world. He described this in the fragmented and careful way that characterized his public statements on the subject as not the work of any single government, not the NSA, though the NSA was part of it, not any of the familiar acronyms that populated public discourse about surveillance and intelligence, something older, something that preceded the institutional structures that were supposed to govern these activities, and that had, over time, learned to use those structures as camouflage, as a layer of official accountability that absorbed public scrutiny while the actual operations continued entirely unexamined beneath it. Some insiders claim that what McAfee was describing in these careful and deliberately incomplete public statements was evidence of something that intelligence researchers and investigative journalists have gestured toward for decades without ever being able to document with the specificity that would make it undeniable. A permanent infrastructure of information control that operated across national boundaries, that was not loyal to any single state or ideology, and that had as its primary objective not the security of any population, but the maintenance of its own invisibility and the continuation of its own access. There are theories that this infrastructure had been built piece by piece through the commercial technology industry itself, that the companies producing the software and hardware that the world's population used for communication, commerce, and the storage of their most private information had been, from their earliest days, designed with this purpose in mind, not by their founders necessarily, not by the engineers and programmers who built them, but by the investors and advisors and government relationships that surrounded them, that funded them, that ensured their survival and their growth, and that required in return something that was never written into any public agreement. Access, not complete access to everything, something more elegant than that, something more deniable. A set of capabilities built into the architecture of systems that billions of people use daily that could be activated under specific circumstances by specific actors through channels that were invisible to the users of those systems and to the regulatory bodies nominally responsible for overseeing them. McAfee had built one of those systems. He knew this. And according to certain reports, the knowledge of what he had built, of what it had been used for, by whom, and toward what ends, was the core of the archive he spent his final years assembling. The insurance policy that he described so publicly and so carefully was not, in this reading of his story, primarily about tax evasion or drug trafficking or any of the other charges that various governments sought to press against him. It was about this. It's about the architecture, about the names attached to it and the transactions that sustained it and the specific technical mechanisms through which it operated. This is necessarily a theory. The documentation that would elevate it beyond theory has not been made public may never be made public, may not exist in the form that McAfee described, but consider the pattern of what happened to him after he began speaking about these subjects with increasing specificity. The Belize situation, which had already forced him from a country he had invested years and significant resources in building a life within, was followed by a period of relative public quiet, during which McAfee reinvented himself with characteristic energy as a political figure. He ran for the Libertarian Party presidential nomination in 2016 and again in 2020. These campaigns were, on their surface, quixotic, but they were also something else. They were platforms. They gave him a legitimate public reason to talk about surveillance, about government overreach, about the relationship between technology companies and intelligence agencies in ways that reached audiences far beyond those who had been following his story from its earlier, more marginal chapters. He used those platforms deliberately. The things he said during his political campaigns about encryption, about the deep integration of commercial technology with the state surveillance infrastructure, about the specific ways in which the privacy of ordinary citizens was being systematically compromised, were not the generalities of a politician seeking votes. They were the specifics of a technical expert describing systems he had personal knowledge of. People in the relevant communities noticed, not just ordinary followers and supporters, people with institutional affiliations and professional reasons to pay close attention to what John McAfee was saying and how precisely he was saying it. And the pressure on him, legal, financial, reputational, intensified in direct proportion to the specificity of what he said. The IRS charges filed in 2020 concerned tax evasion. On their face, they were straightforward financial crimes. McAfee had, by his own admission, not filed tax returns for years. He was openly contemptuous of the tax system and had made no secret of this contempt. As a legal matter, the charges were not difficult to construct, but the timing and the manner of their construction raised questions that McAfee himself raised loudly and that have never been satisfactorily answered. Why, after years of open and documented noncompliance that McAfee had discussed publicly and at length, did the full weight of federal prosecution descend at this particular moment? Why were the charges accompanied by civil asset forfeiture actions of unusual breadth, targeting not just his documented assets, but the assets of people connected to him, creating a web of legal pressure that extended far beyond McAfee himself? According to certain reports, the asset forfeiture actions were specifically designed to map his network, to identify every person who had a financial relationship with him, every account that had received or sent money connected to him, every node in the web of relationships he had built over decades of operating at the edges of multiple different systems. It was, in this reading, not primarily a tax enforcement action. It was an intelligence operation conducted through legal mechanisms, a way of seeing his entire architecture, his contacts, his resources, his distribution network for information, while maintaining the deniable surface of routine financial prosecution. If that reading is accurate, then what the government agencies pursuing McAfee were really trying to map was not his money. It was his knowledge, the specific shape of what he knew, who he had told, and how the information he had accumulated over a lifetime of watching hidden systems could be contained before it reached a point of irreversible public disclosure. They were, in this theory, trying to find the files before he could release them, and McAfee, watching this operation unfold around him with the pattern recognition of a man who had spent his entire life studying systems, understood exactly what was happening. So he ran again. There is a specific quality to the kind of running that John McAfee did in the final years of his life that distinguishes it from ordinary flight. Ordinary flight is reactive. It is the movement of someone responding to immediate danger, putting distance between themselves and a specific threat, seeking a specific safety. What McAfee did was different. It was operational. It had the character of a campaign rather than an escape. He moved across borders and between jurisdictions with a deliberateness that suggested not panic, but calculation, as though each relocation was a move in a game whose rules he understood better than anyone pursuing him. After the IRS indictment landed in 2020, McAfee was living in exile. He had been living in exile in various forms and across various geographies for years before that. moving through the Bahamas, through various European countries, through a period spent aboard a yacht in international waters that had its own particular symbolic resonance. A man with no fixed address, a man whose physical location was, at any given moment, a question that even those closest to him could not always answer with certainty. He documented this existence publicly. This was, once again, a strategic choice rather than a simple expression of personality. Every interview he gave from an undisclosed location, every photograph that confirmed he was alive and coherent and still speaking, every cryptic post that reached his millions of followers across social media platforms, all of it served the same function that his media spectacle during the Belize flight had served. It kept him visible. It kept him in the awareness of an audience large enough to make his disappearance, if it came, impossible to execute quietly. But visibility has the cost. And the cost for McAfee was that every public appearance was also an intelligence event, a data point that the people looking for him could use to narrow the geography of his location, to map the network of people around him, to understand the infrastructure of his existence well enough to begin dismantling it. He understood this too. And it created a tension at the heart of his final years that was genuinely extraordinary to observe. A man using transparency as protection while knowing that the same transparency was feeding the system trying to contain him. A man who had built his career on understanding the dual nature of security architecture, now living inside that duality in the most personal way imaginable. During this period, McAfee gave an extraordinary number of interviews to mainstream outlets and to podcasters and to YouTube channels with audiences of varying sizes. He spoke on encrypted messaging platforms and through intermediaries and in direct video calls that he conducted from locations that were presumably chosen for their anonymity. And across all of these conversations, regardless of the format or the audience or the stated subject, certain themes recurred with a consistency that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or performance. He talked about cryptocurrency at considerable length, and with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed in what he was describing. He talked about the potential of decentralized financial systems to undermine the architecture of financial surveillance that he described as one of the primary mechanisms of institutional control. He was not speaking about this in the abstract. He was speaking about specific technical properties of specific systems, about how value could be moved across borders without passing through the nodes of visibility that the traditional financial system required, about how identity could be decoupled from transaction in ways that made certain kinds of tracking essentially impossible. Some insiders claim that McAfee's intense public advocacy for cryptocurrency during this period was not primarily financial, that he was not, despite the surface appearance of his involvement in various token projects, primarily motivated by Toft. That what he was doing was something more like evangelism, an attempt to accelerate the adoption of technologies that would, if they reached sufficient scale, genuinely threaten the information control infrastructure he had spent years describing. Technologies that would, in a meaningful sense, do to financial surveillance what strong encryption had done to communication surveillance, not eliminate it, but make it orders of magnitude more difficult and expensive to maintain. He was trying to build something, not a company this time, not a product, a structural alternative to the system he believed was watching everything. Whether his cryptocurrency activities were also, on another level, a mechanism for funding his own continued operation, for keeping himself mobile, connected, and supplied with the resources necessary to maintain the kind of existence he was living, is a question that cannot be answered cleanly. The financial architecture of his final years was deliberately and by necessity opaque. This opacity was used against him, cited as evidence of the financial crimes he was charged with, and it served the rhetorical function of making him appear simply criminal rather than specifically threatened. But opacity for a man in McAfee's position was not a choice. It was a survival requirement. In October 2020, Spanish authorities arrested John McAfee in Barcelona. He had been living in Spain for some time, moving between locations in the country with the careful irregularity of someone who understood surveillance patterns. The arrest came on the basis of the American tax evasion charges, accompanied by a request for extradition to the United States. McAfee's response to his arrest was characteristically immediate and public. From inside the detention facility, he communicated through his legal team and through his wife, Janice, who became during this period one of the primary conduits between McAfee and the outside world. The messages that came through these channels were consistent with everything he had said before his arrest. He was being persecuted. The charges were a mechanism for bringing him into American custody. What the American government wanted from him was not a tax payment, but silence. He was also, according to certain reports, remarkably active intellectually during his detention. He was writing, communicating with a network of contacts that his captors could monitor, but apparently not fully interrupt. He was, by the accounts of people who interacted with him during this period, more focused than he had been in years, as though confinement, by eliminating the constant operational demands of life and flight, had given him the stillness necessary to organize and articulate what he knew, with a precision that the chaos of the preceding years had made difficult. The extradition proceedings moved through the Spanish legal system with a pace that McAfee's legal team described as unusual. Extradition cases of this complexity typically take years. The procedural momentum in McAfee's case was faster. His lawyers raised objections, filed motions, argued that the prosecution was politically motivated, and that their client faced not a fair trial, but a managed silencing. The Spanish courts considered these arguments with the careful neutrality of institutions that understood they were being watched. Outside the prison walls, McAfee's public profile continued to operate. His Twitter account, managed in part by Janice and in part by members of his team, maintained a stream of communications that ranged from the political to the cryptic to the directly alarming. There were posts about the files, about the dead man's switch, about specific individuals and specific institutions that McAfee claimed to have documentation on. These posts were observed by hundreds of thousands of followers, screenshotted and shared across platforms, analyzed by people who had been following his story for years. They were also, there's little doubt, being monitored very carefully by people whose professional interest in what John McAfee might release was considerably more urgent than that of his general audience. There is a detail from this period that is worth examining carefully because it sits at the intersection of several different threads in McAfee's story in a way that feels significant without being easily categorizable. In the months before his death, McAfee's communications took on a specific quality that several people who knew him described as unusual. Not the theatrical wildness that had characterized his public persona for years, something quieter, more considered. He was making specific references to documents, to names, to technical details that suggested he was drawing on a very specific and organized body of knowledge rather than speaking in generalities. He was, in the assessment of people who understood the subject matter well enough to evaluate what he was saying, describing things that were accurate, not in the manner of someone who had read about these subjects or heard about them secondhand, but in the manner of someone who had direct and operational knowledge. He was also, according to certain reports, making direct contact with journalists and researchers whom he believed could be trusted with specific pieces of information. Not the full archive, not the files themselves, but fragments, context, the kind of background information that would allow someone, if the full archive ever surfaced, to understand immediately what they were looking at and why it mattered. He was, in other words, preparing, distributing knowledge in a way that was designed to survive him. Not the dramatic dead man's switch of earlier public declarations, but something more patient and more sophisticated. A gradual seeding of understanding into a network of people who would recognize what they had when the time came. Whether that network survived him, whether the seeds he planted have grown into anything that will eventually surface, whether the fragments he distributed to trusted contacts add up in combination with each other to something that can eventually be assembled into the complete picture he claimed to have. These are questions without current answers. But they are questions that certain people in certain institutions are very motivated to ensure remain without answers permanently. The extradition hearing was scheduled, the machinery of official process continued to turn, and John McAfee in his Spanish prison cell continued to write what he wrote and where it went, and whether any of it still exists in a form that could reach the public. That is a thread that has not yet reached its end, or perhaps it has, and the end has simply not been shown to us yet. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs exclusively to people who know things they cannot prove. It is not the loneliness of isolation, though isolation often accompanies it. It is the loneliness of comprehension, of seeing a structure clearly in its full complexity and implication, while being surrounded by people who either cannot see it or have decided, for reasons of safety or convenience or simple self-preservation, to look away. It is the loneliness of the engineer who understands exactly how the bridge was built and exactly why it will fall, standing in a crowd of people who are still walking across it. John McAfee lived inside that loneliness for years, and as the walls of his Spanish detention facility closed around him, it deepened into something that those who communicated with him during this period described as a specific and unusual kind of clarity. Not despair, not resignation, something more like the focused stillness of a man who has accepted the full weight of his situation and is operating within its constraints with everything he has left. To understand the specific nature of what McAfee claimed to know during this final period and why those claims, if even partially accurate, would constitute a problem of extraordinary magnitude for the institutions he was describing, it is necessary to step back from the personal narrative for a moment and consider the broader landscape he was inhabiting. The years between McAfee's departure from the antivirus industry and his arrest in Barcelona had been, in the wider world, years of extraordinary and accelerating revelation about the relationship between technology, government, and surveillance. The Snowden disclosures of 2013 had confirmed with documented specificity that the surveillance infrastructure McAfee and others had been describing in theoretical terms was not theoretical at all. That the collection of data from commercial communication systems, email, phone calls, internet activity, by intelligence agencies operating with minimal oversight and no meaningful public accountability was not a conspiracy theory, but a documented operational reality. The Snowden revelations had shocked a public that had chosen for years to find the warnings of people like McAfee easy to dismiss. They had demonstrated that the architecture of surveillance was real, that it was vast, and that it operated with a comfort and an impunity that suggested not a recently constructed emergency measure, but a long-established and deeply institutionalized system. But Snowden, for all the extraordinary courage and consequence of what he disclosed, had revealed only a portion of what McAfee claimed to know. The NSA programs that Snowden documented were the visible layer, the officially sanctioned, congressionally funded, institutionally acknowledged layer of the surveillance architecture. Massive and troubling as they were, they existed within a framework of at least nominal governmental accountability. They were programs that once revealed could be debated, legislated about, partially reformed. They were, in a meaningful sense, the part of the iceberg that floated above the water. McAfee claimed knowledge of what was below. According to certain reports, what McAfee described in his most specific and most carefully guarded communications was a layer of surveillance and information control infrastructure that operated entirely outside any governmental framework, that was not funded through any official budget, not accountable to any legislative body, not constrained by any legal architecture that any government had ever publicly acknowledged. A system that had been built using the commercial technology industry as its primary construction material, funded through mechanisms that were routed through enough layers of financial complexity to be effectively untraceable, and operated by a network of individuals and entities whose relationship to any official institution was, at most, that of deeply embedded and completely deniable assets. He described this not as a future threat or a theoretical possibility, but as an operational reality that had been functioning in various forms for decades. That had grown with the growth of the internet itself from a relatively contained intelligence operation into something of genuinely civilizational scale, something that touched, in one way or another, every significant flow of information on Earth. There are theories about why McAfee was in a position to know this, if he did. The most straightforward of these theories points to the obvious. He had built critical infrastructure for the digital security industry at its most formative moment, had operated inside the relationships between that industry and governmental intelligence communities. and had accumulated over decades of living at the margins of multiple different systems, sources, and contacts that gave him visibility into operations that most people never came close to, but some insiders claim the explanation goes further. That McAfee's knowledge was not simply accumulated through observation and relationship, but that he had, at certain points in his career, been a more active participant in the architecture he later described as threatening, that he had built things or allowed things to be built using what he had constructed, that he later came to understand in a different and more troubling light. That part of what drove his increasingly urgent need to speak publicly about what he knew was not simply civic conscience, but something closer to the specific and unrelenting discomfort of complicity. This is impossible to verify. McAfee never said this directly, but the texture of his later communications, the urgency, the specificity, the willingness to risk everything for disclosure, has the quality of something personal driving it. Something beyond political conviction or intellectual integrity, something that felt, to those who observed him closely, like a debt that he was trying to repay. What is clear, regardless of the precise nature and source of his knowledge, is that by the time of his arrest, McAfee had developed a detailed and specific account of particular mechanisms, particular actors, and particular technical systems that he believed constituted evidence of crimes of extraordinary magnitude, crimes that implicated not individual bad actors, but institutional structures. Crimes that, if documented and disclosed, would require a reckoning not just with individual wrongdoing, but with the fundamental architecture of how information and power had been organized in the digital age. He understood that the response to such a disclosure, if it happened in an uncontrolled way, would be enormous. Not simply the legal and institutional response, though that would be significant, but the public response. The psychological response of a population that had built its entire daily existence around digital systems and would now be required to understand those systems in a fundamentally different way. He spoke about this sometimes in the careful and indirect language he used for the most serious subjects, with something that sounded almost like compassion, as though the weight of what he knew included the weight of what its disclosure would cost ordinary people who had not asked to be part of any of this. He was also, during this period, acutely aware of the specific ways in which the system would respond to him if given the opportunity. He had watched it respond to others. He had studied, with professional thoroughness, the pattern of what happened to people who accumulated the kind of knowledge he claimed to have, and then made the mistake of being vulnerable. The pattern was consistent, and it did not end well. Julian Assange, whose situation McAfee referenced repeatedly and with an explicitness that suggested he saw direct parallels to his own, had spent years in effective imprisonment, first in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, then in Belmarsh prison, on charges that his supporters characterized as a legally constructed mechanism for preventing disclosure rather than a genuine pursuit of justice. The specifics of Assange's situation were different from McAfee's in important ways, but the structural similarity, a man in possession of information that powerful institutions wanted contained, facing legal jeopardy that seemed calibrated to that containment rather than to any ordinary standard of proportionate prosecution, was not lost on McAfee, and he said so openly. He also referenced, in more oblique terms, a longer historical pattern. The pattern of journalists and researchers and whistleblowers and inconvenient experts who had, over decades, died in circumstances that official investigations characterized as accidental or self-inflicted, but that left behind, for those willing to look, a residue of unanswered questions and implausible official conclusions. He did not name names in these references. He did not need to. The pattern was known to those who had studied it, and the implication was clear. He was watching the same mechanism orient itself toward him. The specific question of what McAfee knew about cryptocurrency, which occupied a large portion of his public communications in his final years, deserves particular attention here because it connects to the broader architecture he was describing in ways that are not immediately obvious. Cryptocurrency, as McAfee described it, was not primarily a financial instrument. It was an information architecture a way of conducting transactions and of moving value, of making agreements, of recording relationships that operated outside the visibility infrastructure of the traditional financial system. And the traditional financial system, as McAfee described it, was one of the primary mechanisms through which the surveillance architecture he was documenting maintained its operational capacity. The ability to see financial flows, to know who was paying whom, for what, and through which channels, was not simply a tool for tax collection or crime prevention. It was a map of power, a real-time, continuously updated picture of who was connected to whom, what those connections were worth, and where the leverage points were. Cryptocurrency, properly implemented, disrupted that map. It created zones of financial activity that were genuinely opaque to the observation infrastructure that had been built around the traditional system. This was, McAfee argued, precisely why the institutional response to cryptocurrency from governments, from central banks, from the financial regulatory apparatus was so disproportionately hostile. Not because of tax evasion, not because of criminal financing, though those concerns were real and legitimate, but because cryptocurrency represented a structural threat to a surveillance architecture that depended on financial visibility for its operational coherence. He was, in this argument, describing his own cryptocurrency activities not as financial crime, but as political resistance, as the use of technical tools to undermine a technical system of control. He was, in other words, doing the same thing he had always done, using his understanding of invisible architectures to find the points where they could be disrupted. And the response to him, the escalating legal pressure, the asset forfeiture, the extradition proceedings, was, in his account, not the response of a government pursuing a tax cheat. It was the response of a system defending itself against someone who understood it. In his cell in Barcelona, with the extradition process moving toward its conclusion, McAfee continued to communicate, continued to write, continued in the fragmented and careful way of a man operating under extreme constraint to distribute pieces of what he knew into the network of people he trusted. He was running out of time. He knew it, and the people watching him knew that he knew it. What none of them could know, or perhaps what some of them knew all too well, was how much time remained and what would happen when it ran out. There is a quality to the final months of John McAfee's life that resists easy description. It is not the quality of defeat, though defeat was present in it. It is not the quality of resignation, though there were moments that those who communicated with him during this period characterized as something approaching acceptance. It is something more complex than either of those things, the specific texture of a consciousness that has fully absorbed the reality of its situation and is choosing within that reality to continue operating with everything it has. A last transmission, a final effort to ensure that what was known would not die entirely with the person who knew it. The Spanish prison where McAfee was held, Brians 2, sits outside Barcelona in the flat industrial landscape of the Catalan interior, a functional modern facility that bore none of the Gothic drama that the circumstances of its most famous inmate seemed to demand. It was an ordinary place, and that ordinariness was perhaps its most unsettling quality. The idea that something of the magnitude McAfee represented, if his account of himself was accurate in any meaningful portion, could be contained and concluded in such a deliberately unremarkable setting. He had been there since October 2020, 8 months, long enough to settle into the rhythms of confinement, to understand the specific constraints of his environment, to map the architecture of his situation with the systematic thoroughness he applied to everything. He communicated with Janice regularly, with his legal team, with a small number of trusted contacts outside. The communications were monitored. He knew they were monitored, and the people receiving them knew they were monitored. But they continued, because the alternative to monitored communication was no communication at all, and silence was a form of defeat that McAfee was not prepared to accept. Janice McAfee became, during this period, one of the most important figures in his story. She was not simply a conduit for his messages. She was an advocate, a strategist, and an increasingly alarmed witness to a process that she described publicly and repeatedly as bearing no resemblance to the ordinary functioning of a legal system. She spoke about the speed of the proceedings, about the specific ways in which her husband's legal team found themselves obstructed at every turn, about the quality of the communication she received from him, which she characterized as lucid, engaged, and completely inconsistent with the mental state of a man approaching suicide. She said this explicitly, many times, before his death and after it, with a consistency and a specificity that carried the weight of someone who had known this man for years, who understood his psychology at an intimate level, and who found the official conclusion not merely questionable, but structurally impossible, given everything she knew about him. McAfee himself addressed the subject directly. In the final months of his detention, he made statements, through his legal team, through social media posts, through interviews that reached the public despite the constraints of his situation, that returned again and again to the same point. He was not suicidal. He had never been suicidal. The idea that he would choose to end his own life was, in his account, not simply false, but specifically and deliberately absurd. He had too much to do, too much still to say, too much still to release. He also said something else during this period that received less attention than it deserved at the time. He said that he recognized the pattern of what was being constructed around him, that the legal proceedings, the extradition process, the specific timing and structure of the pressure being applied to him followed a template he had studied, that he could see in the architecture of what was happening to him the shape of an outcome that was being prepared, that the conclusion was being written before the final chapter had been lived. He said, in one of his final public statements of any length, "They will not take me alive to America." This statement was reported at the time as the declaration of a man who would resist extradition by any means necessary, a dramatic gesture from a man who had always been drawn to drama. But in the context of what followed, in the context of a death that arrived on the same day as the extradition ruling, with a speed and a neatness that foreclosed investigation before investigation could properly begin, the statement reads differently. Not as a threat, as a prediction. The specific circumstances of June 23, 2021 deserve careful examination because the official account of that day contains details that individually might be explicable and unremarkable, but in combination produce a picture that is difficult to reconcile with the conclusion that was officially reached. The Spanish National Court issued its ruling authorizing extradition to the United States in the morning hours of that day. This ruling was communicated to McAfee's legal team. It was, by any measure, the most significant legal development in his case since his arrest 8 months earlier. It was the decision that, if it held through any subsequent appeals, would place him in American custody, in the custody of the jurisdiction he had most specifically and most repeatedly described as the one he feared most. Within hours of that ruling, McAfee was dead. The official timeline, as released by Spanish prison authorities, indicated that McAfee was found unresponsive in his cell in the late afternoon. Attempts at resuscitation were unsuccessful. The cause of death was determined to be hanging. The ruling was suicide. The speed of that determination and the confidence with which prison authorities, and shortly thereafter, the official Spanish response characterized the death as self-inflicted was, according to several observers with relevant professional backgrounds, unusual. Prison deaths of this nature typically involve extended forensic investigation and careful examination of the physical evidence, and a period of official uncertainty before conclusions are reached. The physical evidence, the specific mechanics of hanging in a prison cell with the materials available, the question of whether an individual of McAfee's age and physical condition could have executed what was described, the absence of any preceding behavioral indicators that prison staff were required to document and apparently could not produce, raised questions that were never publicly and satisfactorily addressed. McAfee's legal team reacted with immediate and vocal disbelief. His Spanish lawyer stated publicly that there was no indication whatsoever that their client was contemplating suicide, that they had spoken with him recently, that he had been engaged with his case, with his communications, with the ongoing work of whatever it was he was still trying to accomplish from inside that cell, that the man they knew bore no resemblance to the man described in the official account of his final hours. Janice McAfee, informed of her husband's death while outside Spain, issued a statement that was not the statement of a widow accepting a tragedy. It was the statement of someone who had been expecting something and had not expected this, who found the official account not merely painful, but specifically wrong, who named with the precision of someone who had spent months thinking carefully about exactly this possibility, the forces she believed responsible. She has continued to say these things for years after his death, without retraction and without qualification, with the steady insistence of someone who has looked at the evidence available to her and reached a conclusion that the official verdict cannot accommodate. The autopsy was performed by Spanish authorities. Its findings supported the official conclusion. McAfee's family requested an independent autopsy. There are theories about what that independent examination found and what happened to its results, and why the full findings have not been made comprehensively and transparently public in the years since his death. There are also theories about the cell itself, about what it contained and what it did not contain, about the specific physical circumstances that would need to have existed for the official account to be accurate, and whether those circumstances existed. These theories circulate in the spaces where McAfee's death is discussed seriously, in the communities of people who followed him closely, who understood the technical and operational context of his final years, who had the background to evaluate specific claims against specific evidence. They have not been resolved. The people with the authority and the access to resolve them have not shown any particular interest in doing so. And then there is the question of what happened in the hours and days immediately following his death. The question of the accounts and the networks and the digital infrastructure that was supposed to activate, that was supposed to release something into the world that could not be contained once released. The silence that followed was, as described at the beginning of this story, absolute, not the silence of a dead man's switch that had failed mechanically, not the silence of a system that had been built badly and simply didn't work. Something more considered than either of those explanations. A silence with the specific quality of something that had been deliberately and professionally quieted. Within days of McAfee's death, accounts connected to the release mechanism he had described were suspended across multiple platforms, not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too visible as a coordinated action, but sequentially, in the way that a careful and experienced hand moves through a network, removing nodes one at a time, with enough time between each removal to avoid the appearance of pattern to anyone not watching closely. Some insiders claim that the sequential removal was itself a form of evidence, that the specific order in which accounts were targeted, the specific platforms that acted, and the order in which they acted was consistent with a coordinated operation rather than routine content moderation. That the fingerprints of the operation, if examined carefully, pointed in directions that mainstream analysis of McAfee's death consistently failed to follow. Others argue that the silence simply confirmed what skeptics had always believed, that the dead man's switch was performance, that the files were exaggeration or fabrication, that John McAfee was a brilliant and charismatic man who had constructed, over the final decade of his life, an elaborate mythology around himself that served his psychological and practical needs without ever having the substance he claimed for it. Both of these positions are held by intelligent people who have examined the available evidence carefully. Neither can be conclusively proven, and the impossibility of conclusive proof is itself one of the most significant features of the story, because conclusive proof is exactly what you would expect to be absent if the official account of his death is false and the suppression of his archive is real. The absence of evidence in a situation specifically designed to produce absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. This is something John McAfee understood very well. He had spent his career studying systems designed to hide themselves. He knew that the most sophisticated operations left no trace precisely because their sophistication was devoted to the production of tracelessness. He knew that the most dangerous things in any architecture were the things that weren't there, the back doors, the hidden channels, the absent records that should have existed and didn't. He knew, in other words, exactly what the silence after his death would look like, and he knew that most people, confronted with that silence, would accept the official explanation rather than sit with the discomfort of what the silence might actually mean. He had spent his entire life trying to teach people to look at what wasn't there. Whether anyone was listening was a question he would not live to see answered. There is a specific intellectual discipline required to look at a life like John McAfee's without reducing it to either of the two narratives that institutional common sense makes available. The first narrative is the one that official sources prefer, the story of a brilliant man destroyed by his own excesses, undone by paranoia and recklessness, and an ego too large to survive contact with the ordinary consequences of ordinary crimes. A cautionary tale about what happens when genius curdles into self-destruction, neat, containable, and useful, precisely because it forecloses the questions that the second narrative opens. The second narrative is the one that McAfee himself told, the story of a man who saw too much, knew too much, and was systematically targeted by forces with both the motive and the capability to silence him. A story in which the paranoia was not delusion but accurate perception, in which the recklessness was not self-destruction but the inevitable consequence of trying to operate freely in a world that had decided he should not be free, in which the death was not the conclusion of a broken life but the execution of a specific institutional decision. The difficulty is that neither of these narratives, taken alone, is sufficient, and the truth, if truth is accessible at all in a story this deliberately obscured, almost certainly lives in the complicated and uncomfortable space between them, in the recognition that a man can be genuinely brilliant and genuinely self-destructive, that paranoia and accurate perception are not mutually exclusive, that the excesses of a personality can be simultaneously authentic and strategically weaponized by the people who need to discredit it, that a life can be both chaotic and targeted, both complicit and betrayed. What is possible and what the story has attempted to do is to examine the pattern, to look at the specific sequence of events across McAfee's life, not as a collection of disconnected episodes, but as a structure, and to ask whether that structure, viewed as a whole, tells us something that the individual episodes viewed in isolation do not. The pattern begins with a childhood defined by the intimate experience of official narratives masking private realities. It continues through an education that trained a naturally suspicious and structurally oriented mind to find what was hidden beneath what was presented. It accelerates through a career that placed that mind at the precise intersection of commercial technology and governmental intelligence, at the exact historical moment when that intersection was being constructed. It deepens through a period of withdrawal and accumulation of knowledge, of contacts, of the specific map of invisible systems that McAfee spent decades building. It ruptures in Belize, where the withdrawal from official systems had gone far enough that official systems decided to respond. It intensifies through years of flight and public declaration, during which McAfee said more and more specifically about what he claimed to know, and it concludes, nor appears to conclude, in a Spanish prison cell on the day that American custody became legally imminent, in circumstances that official investigation closed too quickly and too cleanly for anyone paying serious attention to find satisfying. That is the pattern, and the pattern has a shape that deserves to be named. It is the shape of a man who was, for most of his life, too useful to be removed and too visible to be safely targeted, and who, in his final years, became too dangerous to be allowed to continue and too contained to be protected by visibility alone. A man who spent decades accumulating knowledge that powerful interests would have preferred he not have, who spent his final years trying to distribute that knowledge in ways that would survive him, and who died at the precise moment when the last available mechanism for containing him permanently was about to slip away. Whether that shape reflects reality or is a projection of the narrative instinct onto random events, that is the question that cannot be answered cleanly. That is the question that the official conclusion is specifically designed to prevent from being asked seriously. But there are other patterns beyond the specific arc of McAfee's own life that are worth examining in this context, because McAfee's story does not exist in isolation. It exists within a longer history of people who occupied similar positions, who possessed similar knowledge, who posed similar threats to similar institutional interests, and whose ends arrived in similarly convenient and similarly opaque circumstances. The history of what might be called inconvenient expertise, of the specific fate that has, with notable frequency, befallen individuals possessing documented knowledge of operations that powerful institutions needed kept invisible, is not a history that mainstream analysis engages with systematically. It is treated, when it is treated at all, as a collection of unrelated coincidences, as individual tragedies explicable in purely personal terms, as the ordinary statistical noise of mortality and misfortune rather than the output of an identifiable pattern. But when you lay the cases side by side, when you examine the specific circumstances of the deaths and disappearances of specific individuals who possess specific inconvenient knowledge at specific historically significant moments, the noise begins to resolve into signal, not definitively, not provably in any court, but with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence and that points, however uncomfortably, toward the existence of a management process, a way of handling people who have become problems, a mechanism that operates at the intersection of legal jeopardy, institutional pressure, reputational destruction, and, when necessary, something more terminal. McAfee was aware of this history. He had studied it. He referenced it in his characteristically oblique way in interviews and posts during his final years, not in the manner of someone who had discovered something shocking, but in the manner of someone who had known about it for a long time and was now, with the particular focus of a man who found himself inside the pattern he had been studying, trying to make sure that the people paying attention understood what they were looking at. He was also, during this period, engaged in something that received less public attention than his more theatrical pronouncements, but that was, according to certain reports, among the most significant activities of his final years. He was attempting to establish contact with specific individuals and institutions that he believed might have both the motivation and the capability to ensure that what he knew survived him in a form that could eventually be used, not journalists necessarily. Not the mainstream media institutions whose relationship with the intelligence communities he described had, in his assessment, long since been compromised in ways that made them unreliable conduits for the kind of information he was carrying. Something more specific. Researchers working in particular areas of digital forensics and financial investigation. Legal teams attached to specific international bodies, individuals within the technical community who had the background to evaluate what he was describing and the independence to do something with it, whether these contacts were made, whether the information he was attempting to transmit reached anyone capable of receiving it and acting on it, whether the network he was trying to build around the knowledge he possessed exists in any functional form today. These questions have no publicly available answers. The people involved, if they exist, have excellent reasons to remain silent. The information, if it was received, has excellent reasons to remain carefully held while the circumstances of its eventual use are evaluated. There are theories that suggest this is exactly what is happening, that what appears to be the definitive conclusion of McAfee's story, the prison, the death, the silence, the official verdict, is not a conclusion at all, but a pause, a period of strategic quiet, while the pieces of what he distributed are assembled into something that can eventually be deployed, that the archive or portions of it survived him in forms that are currently beyond the reach of the people who would most want to suppress them. That the dead man's switch, despite its apparent failure in the immediate aftermath of his death, was never a single mechanism but a distributed one, and the distribution is still in process. This is, to be clear, speculation. It is the most optimistic reading of a story that offers very little grounds for optimism, but it is speculation grounded in a specific understanding of how McAfee thought, how he built things, and what a man of his technical sophistication would have actually done when faced with the specific threat he faced. He would not have built a single switch. He would have built a network. He would have distributed not just copies of the files, but the context necessary to understand them, the keys necessary to access them, and the relationships necessary to ensure that even if most of the network was dismantled, enough remained to eventually reconstruct the whole. Because that is what he had always done. From the earliest days of his career, his instinct had been to seed rather than to concentrate, to distribute rather than to centralize, to build systems robust enough to survive the targeted destruction of any individual component. He had spent his entire career building things that survived without him. The question of whether he succeeded in applying that same principle to the most important thing he ever built, to the archive that he described as the culmination of everything he had seen and learned and understood across a lifetime of watching hidden systems, is a question that time may eventually answer, or may not. There's also something else worth naming as this story approaches its conclusion, something that sits beneath all of the specific claims and counterclaims, beneath all of the documented facts and unverifiable theories, beneath the entire elaborate structure of what is known and what is suspected and what remains permanently obscured. It is the question of what it costs a society when people like John McAfee are not listened to, when the pattern of their lives is dismissed as pathology rather than examined as evidence, when the things they say, however imperfectly and however inconveniently, are processed through a filter of institutional common sense that is specifically designed to render them inaudible. Because even if every specific claim McAfee made in his final years was exaggerated, even if the files were smaller than he described, the knowledge less precise, the archive less complete, even if the dead man's switch was more performance than mechanism, and the connections he drew between his own fate and the larger architecture of surveillance and control were more intuitive than documented. Even then, the general structure of what he was describing, the intimate relationship between commercial technology and governmental intelligence, the surveillance infrastructure embedded in the digital systems that the world's population uses daily, the gap between what those systems present themselves as and what they actually do, that structure is not theoretical. It is documented. It is confirmed by evidence that has nothing to do with John McAfee. It is the world as it actually exists, acknowledged by the institutions that built it in the moments when acknowledgement became unavoidable, and denied by those same institutions in every other moment. McAfee saw it earlier than most, described it more specifically than most, paid a higher price for describing it than almost anyone else. Whether that price was paid to silence him or was simply the inevitable toll of a life lived in permanent collision with every structure that attempted to contain it, that is the question that his story leaves unresolved. And unresolved questions, as John McAfee understood better than almost anyone, are the most dangerous kind because they stay open, they continue to ask themselves, they accumulate force over time, drawing toward them every new piece of evidence, every new development, every new voice that arrives to say, I also saw something, I also know something. I also cannot make the official account add up. The questions that John McAfee's life and death leave behind are still accumulating force, and somewhere, in a form and a location that remains unknown, there may be answers. Every story that ends without resolution carries inside it the specific gravity of everything that was never said, not the weight of absence. Absence is clean, finite, a defined space where something was and is no longer, but the weight of the withheld, of the thing that exists somewhere, in some form, in some hands, but has not yet arrived at the place where it can be received and understood and acted upon. That weight does not diminish with time. It accumulates. It presses against the official silence that was built to contain it, finding the hairline fractures in the structure, testing the integrity of the seal. John McAfee has been dead for years now. The official account of his death stands unchanged, unchallenged by any authoritative counter-investigation, supported by the full institutional weight of the Spanish and American legal and governmental apparatus. The case, in every official sense, is closed. The man is gone. The charges against him died with him, as charges do. The extradition that triggered the final sequence of events became moot the moment his heart stopped in that Barcelona prison cell. The machinery of official process, having consumed him, moved on to other business with the seamless indifference of machinery that does not require the resolution of every question to continue functioning. The world moved on too, as it does. The news cycle that briefly illuminated his death darkened within days, replaced by the ordinary urgency of other events, other crises, other stories demanding the finite attention of a public already saturated with complexity. John McAfee became, with the speed that characterizes the information age he had helped to build, a historical figure, a cautionary tale, a footnote in the larger story of technology's complicated relationship with power and freedom and the unexpected consequences of building systems whose full implications their builders did not always foresee. That is the official afterlife of John McAfee, the version that the institutions which outlived him are content to leave in place. But there is another afterlife, less visible, less officially sanctioned, more alive in the specific ways that unresolved things stay alive, in the communities of people who followed his story closely and have not been satisfied by the conclusion they were offered, in the researchers and journalists who continue years after his death to pull at the threads of his final years and find that the threads do not end where the official account says they end. In the technical community that understood with a precision that general audiences could not match exactly what he was describing when he spoke about surveillance architecture and hidden systems and the specific vulnerabilities of the digital infrastructure that the modern world had built around itself. And in those communities, John McAfee's death did not close anything. It opened something. It opened the specific and urgent question of what happens to the knowledge that a person carries when the official verdict about that person is designed to discredit the knowledge along with the person. When the eccentricity and the excess and the legal jeopardy are weaponized not simply against the individual, but against everything the individual claimed to know, so that the act of taking the knowledge seriously requires first overcoming the social and reputational cost of being associated with someone the official narrative has designated as unreliable. This is a mechanism that has been used before. It is, according to certain reports, one of the most reliable tools available to institutions that need to manage inconvenient expertise, the destruction of the vessel as a means of discrediting the contents. The construction around a person possessing dangerous knowledge of a biographical context so lurid and so compromised that any serious engagement with what that person actually said becomes, socially and professionally, a form of self-harm. McAfee's biography was unusually rich material for this purpose. The drugs, the guns, the legal entanglements across multiple jurisdictions, the accusations that were never proven but never entirely cleared, the marriages and the relationships and the compounds and the running, all of it provided an inexhaustible supply of context that could be deployed selectively and strategically to ensure that serious engagement with his specific and documented claims about surveillance and power and hidden systems remained confined to the margins of mainstream discourse. Whether this material was cultivated deliberately, whether some portion of the chaos that surrounded McAfee in his later years was encouraged or amplified by people with specific interests in his discreditation, and so this is impossible to establish with certainty. What can be established is that the effect was reliable and consistent. Every time the specific content of his claims about surveillance architecture received serious attention, the biographical context was available to redirect that attention toward the messenger and away from the message. He was aware of this. In his more reflective public moments, he described it with the resigned clarity of someone who understood the mechanism being used against him but could not find a way to operate outside it. He had become, through the accumulated weight of his own life choices and the deliberate amplification of those choices by people with specific interests, almost perfectly suited to be dismissed, to be the person whose claims about hidden systems were taken as further evidence of his disconnection from reality rather than as the informed observations of someone with unique and documented proximity to the systems he was describing. This is one of the cruelest ironies of his story. The same qualities that made him capable of accumulating the knowledge he claimed to have, the willingness to operate outside institutional constraints, the appetite for experience at the edges of what was sanctioned, the refusal to be bound by the social contracts that kept most people safely distant from certain kinds of information, were precisely the qualities that made him easy to dismiss as a source of that knowledge. He was discredited by his own biography, and some portion of that biography, there are theories that persistently suggest, was written by people who understood exactly what they were doing. In the years since his death, certain specific pieces of what McAfee described have become more verifiable rather than less, not through any dramatic disclosure from the archive he claimed to have assembled. But through the ordinary accumulation of investigative journalism and legal proceedings and whistleblower disclosures and technical research that has incrementally and without fanfare continued to map the terrain he was describing. The relationship between major technology companies and intelligence agencies has been documented in greater detail since his death than it was during his lifetime. The specific technical mechanisms through which commercial software can be and has been used for governmental surveillance have been described with increasing precision by researchers with the expertise to evaluate them. The financial architecture that routes surveillance infrastructure funding through layers of commercial activity designed to obscure its institutional origins has been, in several specific instances, partially traced and partially described by investigators working in multiple jurisdictions. None of this has produced the comprehensive and undeniable disclosure that McAfee described his archive as containing. None of it points directly to the specific network of actors and operations he claimed to have documented, but it confirms, piece by piece and with increasing specificity, that the general landscape he was describing was real, that the territory he claimed to have mapped exists, that the invisible architecture of surveillance and information control that he spent the last years of his life trying to bring into public view is not a fantasy or a paranoid projection, but a genuine and documented feature of the world in which we all live. What remains unknown, or what may remain unknown indefinitely, is the specific and verifiable core of what he actually had. The difference between a man who understood the landscape in general terms and a man who had documented it with the forensic specificity that would allow the responsible institutions to be named and the responsible individuals to be held accountable. That difference is everything. It's the difference between a warning and a weapon. And it is precisely the uncertainty about which of those things McAfee actually possessed that has kept his story alive in the years since his death, and that will continue to keep it alive in the years ahead. Because if he had only the landscape, only the general map, the structural understanding, the informed intuition of a man who had been inside the right rooms at the right times, then his death, however it came, resolved nothing that would not have resolved itself eventually. The landscape he described is being mapped by others, through other means, with a thoroughness that will eventually produce the kind of documentation that demands response. But if he had the specific material, if the archive was real and complete and contains what he described, names, transactions, technical specifications, documented connections between commercial infrastructure and covert operation, then his death resolved something very specific. It removed from circulation the one person who could provide the context necessary to make that material fully legible, who could explain not just what the document showed, but why they mattered, what they connected to, what the full picture looked like when all of the pieces were assembled. The documents without the context are a puzzle without its solution, difficult to interpret, easy to discredit, possible to manage. And the management of difficult information is something that the people McAfee described are, by his account and by the available evidence, extraordinarily good at. So we are left at the end of this story with the specific and irreducible uncertainty that has characterized it from the beginning. An uncertainty that is not the uncertainty of insufficient evidence, though sufficient evidence is certainly lacking, but the uncertainty of a situation specifically engineered to be unresolvable, a death that was ruled too quickly, files that never arrived, a silence that descended too efficiently, a narrative that closed too neatly around a man whose entire life had been a study in the refusal of neat closure. John McAfee was born into a household that taught him the distance between official stories and lived reality. He spent his career building systems that modeled that distance in technical form, that protected against the invisible things moving through networks, or claimed to, or did both simultaneously in ways that served purposes he did not fully disclose. He spent his final years trying to collapse that distance, to bring the invisible things into visibility, to make the hidden architecture of the world legible to the people living inside it. Whether he succeeded or failed, or succeeded partially in ways that are still working themselves out beneath the surface of a world that has moved on from his death, that is not a question that this story can answer. It is not a question that any story can answer yet. What this story can do, and what it has attempted to do, is hold the question open, to refuse the premature closure of the official verdict, to insist that the specific and documented strangeness of how John McAfee lived and how he died deserves sustained and serious attention rather than the comfortable dismissal of a world that finds it easier to accept the neat explanation than to sit with the weight of what the neat explanation requires us to ignore. He told us they would call it suicide. He told us, with the calm and specific certainty of a man describing a system he understood technically and personally, that if he died in custody, it would not be by his own hand. He told us this before it happened. He told us what to look for. He told us what questions to ask. He built, in other words, one final system, not an antivirus program, not a dead man's switch, but a framework for reading his own death, a set of instructions distributed publicly over months and years for how to look at what happened to him and understand what it meant. Whether we choose to use that framework is ultimately a question about what kind of attention we are willing to give to the things that powerful institutions prefer we look away from, what kind of discomfort we are willing to inhabit in the service of questions that resist comfortable answers. John McAfee spent his entire life refusing to look away. It cost him everything. What it bought, what it may yet buy, if the archive is real and if the seeds he planted in trusted hands are still growing in the dark, is something that cannot yet be counted. The files have not arrived, but the question of whether they exist, of whether somewhere in the encrypted silence of a world built from invisible systems, the most dangerous knowledge one man ever claimed to carry is still waiting for the moment when it can finally, irrevocably reach the light. That question is still open. And open questions, as John McAfee knew better than almost anyone alive, are the ones that change everything when they finally find their answer. If you have reached the end of the story and find yourself unwilling to accept the official silence, you are asking exactly the right question. What do you think really happened to John McAfee? What do you think he knew? And who, if anyone, do you believe is still protecting the files that never arrived? Leave your answer below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the most dangerous thing you can do in a world built on managed narratives is refuse to stop asking.